Good day to you. I'm not a big movie watcher, but one movie that I watched that I will always remember, and so will a lot of other people who watch the same movie in the movie theaters, was a film called Basic Instinct. Basic Instinct, I think it came out in the 1990s. It starred an actress from Pennsylvania, Sharon Stone. And the basic plot is she's accused of a murder of a rock star, and she's being interrogated when the famous scene happens. The famous scene, as it's called, all you have to do is Google the film Basic Instinct and you'll find it. Under interrogation, with Michael Douglas doing the interrogation, the actress Sharon Stone uncrosses her legs while she's wearing a dress to expose her crotch. Now, that was a riveting scene that many people were talking about. It was long before pornography was on the internet, so it was a really big deal for a scene like that to be in a film. And I just remember my own particular experience with that scene was I felt a lot of contrasting emotions. I'm a person who's attracted to the opposite sex. I wasn't married at the time, not that that would necessarily make a difference, but when she did that, I felt forced to look at her crotch by the film, the way that it was shot. And I almost found it to be grotesque in a way because she was sitting in a chair and the camera was peering into her private areas, but at the same time, there was something erotic about it. There was something that was stimulated in me that I had no choice over. And so it's that kind of a reaction that we're taking on, and more reactions today when we talk about our second to last chapter, which is on erotic analysis. Yeah, we actually have a kind of analysis called erotic analysis, and that word erotic does come from Eros, the Greek god of primordial lust. Primordial lust, sublimated impulses, and fertility. So primordial lust is when you can't control yourself. Sublimated impulses are those feelings that Freud talked about that we push down because society doesn't allow us to express them. And creative urges you can understand to be horniness, and fertility is the act of procreating, is perpetuating the human race. So the pleasure is what we're talking about here. Pleasure, because that's what erotic analysis really looks at. It starts with looking at pleasure. And there are various theories of pleasure, but all of them speak to the fact that today when media content producers produce content, they are trying to appeal more than anything else to pleasure, not to intellect, not to social status, not to education. They are trying to appeal to pleasure. And so we're going to take a look at pleasure today, but scholars have largely avoided the topic of pleasure in their research. Only in the 1980s did scholars really start to look at pleasure, how it's constructed, and how it functions in certain contexts when media are satisfying certain pleasures that we're seeking. So the first researcher was a Frenchman, a French researcher, French philosopher, Roland Barthes. He was also a semiologist, if you remember that, the study of signs and symbols. And he wrote a book called The Pleasure of Text in 1975, and he talked about three concepts that start to make up this framework of erotic analysis. The first one being plaisir. Plaisir. That's the French word for pleasure, P-L-A-I-S-I-R. It's when Barthes is using that term, he's talking about a comfortable pleasure that we get from passive interaction with the text, with the media content. Now, please don't understand that pleasure necessarily is sexual. It can be other kinds of pleasure. I watched a Netflix film called Red Zone the other day with my wife, Kelly, and it starred The Rock, another Pennsylvania actor, and there was a scene in it where this raging bull, an animal, the bull comes racing towards The Rock, and it strikes him head on, and he only tips over. And the way the film did it was they sped up the motion of the bulls to make it even more comedic. It was almost like a Three Stooges skit. And I got pleasure out of that. I thought it was funny as hell that this giant animal could could hit a guy so hard, and he just barely tipped over and then put his fingers down, stood right up and ran away. It was a comfortable interaction. It was a passive interaction with the text and just taking it on. When you have plaisir, it's where audiences are willingly submitting to the structured invitations from the text and speeding that up. That sequence of the bull hitting the rock was designed to make the audience laugh because it was so funny. It seemed so fast. It's a kind of both conservative and hegemonic pleasure. It's easy. We feel comfortable expressing it in public. It washes over us. That's the hegemonic part. We don't have a lot of control over it. It happens a lot when we watch a film. Okay, so that's one kind of pleasure. Then there's another level of pleasure called jouissance. Jouissance, you can get the French word spelling of that, which means bliss, ecstasy, and even orgasm. So instead of, in this case, submitting to a text, the audiences remake the text to meet their own needs. You stop the film to see a person who attracted you, and you replay it so you can see them again. Or there's cleavage that you want to see. Or there's a bulge in their pants that you want to see again. And you're looking at that. It's where you're manipulating the text. It could be pornography on the internet where you are masturbating. It could be taking a song that was produced by a rapper and mixing it up and mashing it in a nightclub with another song. It could be cutting out a newspaper photograph of a person and putting it onto your wall in your dorm room. That's where the text is no longer intact. You're interrupting it. And the jouissance dimension of pleasure says that you are experiencing a disruptive kind of pleasure because you've changed the message, because you're actively engaging with the message. It functions, this kind of pleasure, as a transgressive, means moves us out of and moves us into a whole new realm, or counter-hegemonic pleasure. It's not what was intended as far as the construction of the message. We've changed it. Video gaming certainly can fit onto this because you can choose your profile and choose your plot in gaming. And then there's a third level of pleasure, and that third level is media erotics. Media erotics involves transgression and production. We mentioned transgression a moment ago, but now we're going to speak about it in full. Transgression is action that breaks with prevailing codes and conventions. It's also known as resistive reading. So you are taking in a text, not by trying to assume the premises and follow the logic of the person who produced the text or the writers or the editors. Instead, you're trying to rearrange it. It's all driven by eros, which is that primordial lust, that those sublimated impulses, those creative urges, and the need for some, not all, to procreate for fertility. There are several dimensions of media erotics that we take a look at, one being the productive dimension, and that's where there are erotic interactions that generate alternative pleasures and meanings. There are erotic interactions that generate alternative pleasures and meanings. For example, if you're gay and you're watching a romantic couple that happen to be, quote, heterosexual or if you are I shouldn't say gay, if you're non-heterosexual in this context, and you're watching a heterosexual couple and they're kissing, and you put yourself in the place of being the woman or the man because you like the character that they're kissing. It's an example, in this case, of being productive. It's seeking alternative pleasures and meanings from what was the intended pleasure and meaning from the people who constructed that scene. Then there's the idea of consumptive texts. Consumptive texts defer to the text and its dominant pleasures. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about productive texts. Consumptive texts are you kind of give yourself over to, if you're watching a Lucille Ball episode. Lucille Ball was a famous comedian from the 1950s on television. She was the first one to use the laugh track in television. Before, comedies did not have a laugh track. Now everybody laughs when they're supposed to laugh because of the laugh track. You still see it today, and in almost any sitcom on television, the laugh track is still there. That's a consumptive text. Productive texts, on the other hand, they are co-created texts. You are creating them, and also the authors are creating them. Very interesting idea, is it not? These kinds of texts often have a sensuous, transgressive way in which audiences interact with those texts. It takes them out of what they previously thought of were taboo subjects, and they end up realizing that they were adhering to a certain code about not taking pleasure in things because that code said that those kinds of pleasures were taboo. Like, I think video gamers can be said to be about. There was an unwritten rule. You cannot take pleasure in someone being murdered. Whenever murder was portrayed on television, it was, this is horrible. That person needs to go to prison. Murder? What are you talking about? We can't tolerate that. Don't you smile at somebody who's murdered, even though they themselves are a murderer. Don't smile at a capital punishment. But that becomes taboo when you give yourself over and smile. I'm not saying you should. I think murder is the worst thing that you could possibly do to another person. And yet if you smile at it, you are at the same time breaking a taboo. So this does involve subjective desires, media erotics, and it's not simply an innate desire to produce something that is then accepted by the audience. The audience plays with it. Now let's go into what transgressive text consists of, to pry that idea apart, where you have a text that can be open or closed to people manipulating it and coming up with their own pleasure. That's what we're talking about here. We've got three more than three types of transgressive text. We've got the readerly text. That's where the meaning is relatively clear and settled. We were working on a letter. I say the provost leadership team for East Stroudsburg University. I have a seat on that team. We're working on a letter today to send out to parents of students saying, did you know that your students can register for classes right now? Because there are like 1,900 students at ESU who have not yet registered for the spring semester. So we're trying to let parents know in case they want to talk to their sons and daughters. And the message we were working on became smaller and smaller and smaller. It used to start out as 2 paragraphs, and it basically became, parents, did you know that your son or your daughter can register? In other words, it became much more of a readerly text where the meaning is really, really clear and settled, as compared to a writerly text. That's the next kind of text. A writerly text is unfinished. It invites the audience to co-create. Almost every episode of Breaking Bad, remember that show? It's quite old by now, but it was breakthrough television, Breaking Bad, about a high school teacher who becomes a methamphetamine dealer with one of his students, and a really big time dealer. Is a totally preposterous premise. That show finished every week with a cliffhanger where you did not know whether the person who was in the cliffhanger survived or not. It was almost always Heisenberg, the lead character in the show. And that's an example of a writerly text. It's left open-ended. It doesn't have to be open-ended at the end. It can be left open-ended in the middle. If you're watching a Jerry Springer episode on television and you hear people swearing and then some of it's bleeped out, it's open-ended, right? Like, what did they say? It might be obvious to you, but that's what a writerly text is. The audience doesn't participate in the meaning in a writerly text, the text is not fulfilling to them. They want to be part of participating. Compare that to intertextuality. Intertextuality is the ways that a text creates or refers to other texts. So the Marvel film series is famous for that, especially the Avengers part of the Marvel franchise. They're always referring to the other Marvel films in the Avengers films. You can see this throughout Netflix episodes with real people referring to other TV shows while they're talking. Books refer to other books, especially if it's a series that you're reading. This is what intertextuality does, and you have to consider that when you are an audience member, because you're not just accessing content in a vacuum when you're looking at media content. You may have context with that content because you've seen it in other media venues. That's what intertextuality is about, and there are actually 3 types of it. You've got parodic, you have a parody, and then you have parodic allusion. That's where the text incorporates caricature of another text. So you're taking an example of another text and you're making it an outrageous example of itself. So, for example, Paul McCartney was interviewed on the differences between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Paul McCartney, the bassist for the Beatles, and he said, well, the Rolling Stones are basically a blues cover band, but we had a lot more musical interest with Indian music, etc. So Mick Jagger, the lead singer of the Rolling Stones, on his last tour, he went up to sing in Los Angeles at one of their venues, and he comes on the stage and he says, all right, we're going to invite Paul McCartney up here to do some cover tunes with us. And that was his way of making fun of Paul McCartney. It's parody, but he's also making Paul McCartney into a caricature. Paul McCartney by no means is saying that the Rolling Stones is only a cover band, but his words were taken out of context, and Mick is making fun of Paul McCartney and saying that by turning him into a caricature. Another type of intertextuality is creative appropriation, and that's where the text actually incorporates portion of another text. If you watch any David Portnoy pizza review, Barstool Pizza and his One Bite Pizza, it's all over YouTube, he often will refer to a past review that he did of another pizza while he's standing outside a pizza place that he's about to do a review of their pizza for. And when he goes into the past, they have edited and inserted a black and white clip of when he did a pizza review in the past. And that's what we're talking about. Creative appropriation. A text incorporates a portion of another text into it. And then we have self-reflexive reference. Self-reflexive reference, that's where the text references other texts in ways that demonstrate self-awareness of its own textual history or production. Okay, this one's a little bit tougher to find. This is where when the media text has a dimension to it that is sort of complementing itself by showing where it stands in the development of the particular pleasure that has occurred over time. So if we take the example of an Avenger film, again, we have any of those characters who, by virtue of being in a series, 1, 2, 3, 4, and by virtue of being in a palette of films that are all part of the same franchise, there's a look about them, is there not? There's a look about them that suggests they know that this was their moment in history. When we look back in history, were films that were created that incorporated science fiction and comedy and adventure and romance and over-the-top special effects all into one. And will that ever truly happen again? It's hard to know, but the sense is that they sense they're making history, and that's what self-reflexive reference refers to. Now let's move on to some other types of transgressive text. We're still in this long list here. We've got polyphony. Polyphony, there's many voices of a text. Many voices of a text. This is where the story in a text has many characters that are speaking to it. So if you have a film, and instead of having a narrator who you never see, like a Morgan Freeman, very famous narrator of films, who's not actually in the film, instead you have the characters saying their lines themselves. Many different characters speaking for the film itself. Next up, you have carnivalesque text. Carnivalesque text for Benedictine, and he says that texts that embody temporary liberation from the prevailing truth and social order are what we get pleasure from, and that these departures from prevailing truth and social order, it results in festivals and feasts and like a medieval carnivalesque atmosphere. If you went to a carnival to look at a two-headed woman, as people did in a carnival, or a man who was the tallest man in the world, this is what people went to carnival. There's a grotesque realism. These are real people, but people are going to look at them to say they are way outside of the boundaries of what we know the average person or even our range of people that we've met to be like. So there's like a grotesque pleasure we get from looking at them. And that's what carnivalesque refers to. And then we've got grotesque realism. Grotesque realism is an aesthetic of degradation. You can say that sadomasochism in the sexual world, people who are really into handcuffs or whips, or in extreme cases, golden showers and things of that nature that we all know exist that are called, it's a lowering of the pleasure taste to a grotesque realism. There's a spirituality to it. The authors claim, I can't quite accept that. You can decide for yourself. But it's where several things are happening, including that the body is disfigured and polluted. We can say that tattooing, piercings, all of that refers to pleasure that's fitting within this particular definition, grotesque realism. You're defiling the body as it was born, in terms of the way it was born. There's also abjection. Abjection is what disturbs the identity, the system, the order, what captivates and repulses. It's what exactly is at the core of what is supposedly the most offensive to those people who are not participating in gross realism. There's defilement of certain social categories, things like feces, which are very, very private to each individual, urine, also very private, sperm, menstrual blood. All of these are body fluids that are very, very private and personal to us that we experience on a daily or monthly basis that become part of grotesque realism and pleasure. Pleasure comes from both from being captivated and being repelled at the same time. It's, the Stockholm Syndrome. Have you heard about that? It was referred to in Money Heist. That's where the captives, those who are captive, learn to love their captors after being in. Is that what happened to Elizabeth Smart? You can look up that story. It's a very strange thing to consider. And that's what this is speaking about. Abjection. It's where pleasure comes both from being the person who's holding somebody in captivity, but at the same time they're repelling you. There's a pleasure that comes from that. There is also uncrowning, which is where you degrade and debase that is otherwise which is lofty and high. I went to a Belgian museum in Belgium, and I saw a painting that struck me. It was several members depicted who were of the royal family, kings and queens, standing on a balcony peeing on peasants below. I thought that was most unusual for a painting that was done in the 1600s or 1700s, but that's what it was. It was uncrowning. It was degrading and debasing people who are supposedly the elite, educated, governing societal members, the royal family, and showing them to be disgusting people who look down on their subjects. That's uncrowning right now. And then finally we have ambivalence. Ambivalence, or something that is ambivalent. And this fuels the possibility of social change, but it doesn't resolve it because it provides a dialogue that takes place between the self and the other with no conclusion. The self being yourself, the other being the media producer, or from the media producer standpoint, the media producer being the self, and you being in the audience being the other, and the media producer trying to nudge you along, for example, to vote for a Republican for the first time so that you feel pleasure in a new way. Maybe you want to feel like you really are for private enterprise and the right to make as much money as you can if you associate that with a Republican belief. Or maybe you're a Republican being convinced perhaps by a Democratic ad to care for the environment if you associate caring with the environment with Democrats and the pleasure that might bring to you because you care about the environment. And so you come along by the commercial, and then you see something at the end of the commercial that reminds you why you're not a Democrat or reminds you why you're not a Republican. So you're ambivalent. You're left at the end by that. Now let's move to transgressive practices. Transgressive practices, just as texts vary in their degrees of openness, that's what we just talked about, how open texts are, so do audiences vary in their degree of attentiveness. I can watch a news program with my wife, and her idea of watching it is having the laptop open and occasionally hearing a phrase and then asking me about it. My idea of it is I've got to have my eyes on the screen, but occasionally I will look at my phone, but I have to be able to listen to the television at the same time. So we have two different levels of attentiveness, you can say, and that's how people attend to audience members as well. So as audience activity increases, so does the potential for erotic pleasure and textual interaction. As the audience attentiveness increases, so do those things increase. So what counts as transgression? How can we tell if transgression has taken place in trying to understand transgressive practices of the audience? Well, we look at interpretive play. That's what we try to find, interpretive play, to see whether transgression has taken place. And interpretive play is whether there is an improvisational mode of audience-text interaction. Is it improvised? Is the audience sitting there taking it all in and they don't stop the media content? Or do they stop it? Somebody who goes to an open mic night where a band is playing using the media of a microphone and electrified guitars, the first person that stands up is not following a script. They're improvising and dances. Now other people dance. It's improvisational. Now we look at cruising. That's the next term for interpretive play. Cruising, this is stating as an assumption that the body is on a lookout for its own desire, not to take in understanding. The body wants desire, not to take in understanding of a text. So you get lost in the colors of a film while missing the entire dialogue. That's what cruising is about. It's trying to kind of peripheral, tactile, that's feeling, pleasure that you want to wash over. That's what you're seeking when you're looking at something. And that's different from drifting. Drifting is generating highly personal associates with the text. It's not daydreaming, but in a way it is looking away and relating dimensions of you at a personal level to what you're taking on in the text. So, for example, I watched the other day a film that had a Scottish character in it. I don't see many people from Scotland. And it made me remember my father, who was from Scotland. And he's been passed away for 12, 13 years now. And, there's things about the character that remember the way my dad spoke and the particular ways that Scots use language. You can't buy it. They used to say all the time, you can't buy it. And Scots are real big on that, which you can't buy it. You can't buy love. You can't buy happy. You can't buy it. That's what they say. So drifting is you create associations more than always recognizing what those associations are. And then finally we have skimming. Skimming is reading the text purposely. It's not what you think of as skimming probably in the way that you study for exams by skimming chapters of books and skimming reading. That's not what it's talking about. It's to try to find the important themes as quickly as possible. That's what skimming is. Reading the text purposefully to find out the important themes as quickly as possible. When I see a political ad and I don't see anywhere on the ad that says Republican or Democrat right away, I'm looking for the signs. This is coming from a Democrat or Republican because that's going to help me understand the message. It's going to understand the motivation of the person behind the message. So I want to know where they are. And if I don't see that, I'm going to skim. I'm going to skim that media content real quick. All right, let's move on now to user participation and user-created content. This is perhaps where the zenith of erotic pleasure takes place, when you have user participation and user-created content. User participation is where the audience engages with the text with devices that allow for interfaces. So your cell phone today allows for so many ways that you can interact with messages. You can use your thumbs. You can talk to text. You can text to talk. You can snap a photo and send it. You can like. You can share. You can upload a video. You can download a video. You can put a filter on one of your photos. You can change your profile picture. You can look at a Snapchat. You can put something on Instagram. So many different ways that there is user participation in cell phones today. And ultimately what you want is what the psychologist Mihaly, and I'm not even going to try and say her last name, said, is that the audience feels challenged but not frustrated by the activity. I mean, that's what gaming is all about, right? You never have the perfect game, right? You're always trying to better your video gaming game versus the last one that you played. So you have control, where the audience feels challenged but not frustrated. You also have immersion. Immersion is where the external world vanishes, and also the distinction between the player and the game. And is that not video gaming? I mean, I can stand at the top of my stairs telling my son that dinner's ready. Gordon! 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 But he's got those headphones on, and he doesn't hear a thing. I'm banging on the wall. He is in that world completely. That's immersion. The external world vanishes, and there's very little distinction between the player and the game. The player's in the game. The player's not sitting in a seat, typing plastic keys, and making characters appear in animation on a screen according to rules that were written by a software program. No, that's not what's happened. The player's in the game. That's what's happened. Okay, so we do have user participation. Involves immersion. Immersion involves performance. Performance is experimentation with alternative identities. Experimentation with alternative identities. It's fishing in some cases. It's taking on an assumed name. It's taking on an anonymous name. It's putting a photo of yourself that you know is not really accurate for how you look. It's all of that. It's looking at alternative identities and all the different ways that we can explore being somebody else. So we have user participation. We also have user-created content. User-created content is a big piece of the increased pleasure that comes from media today, because there are so many more opportunities for users to create content, meaning so many more opportunities for pleasure. It's where the audience creates the text. Blogs, YouTube channels. This video, after you're done watching it for this class, this video will be on YouTube for I don't know how many years to come. It's user-created content. I don't know who's going to watch it. I don't know who's going to see it, who's going to pass it. I don't know whether it will mean anything. It's user-created content, though, and each and every person is doing it every single day. You're doing that by virtue of being on social media. You know that, right? Every single keystroke you type on your phone, every single one is measured. Every single one is being sold as big data to Google and Facebook. These are companies that are nothing more than advertising agencies, Google and Facebook, that they're selling your data every keystroke. You are working for free. Yeah, you're working for free. Facebook made $80 billion last year. $80 billion. Google, $160 billion. Whoa. All that money, what do they produce? Nothing. They don't make anything. They use your work to make money. Now, this is sneaking this in a little bit here, but I have a whole class on this subject that I'm teaching next semester. And I just have a chapter that came out called a critical communication analysis, a critical communication analysis of the focused self in social media. Focused self is in parentheses. That chapter is assigned in this class that I'm teaching next semester if you want to take it. It's CMST 340. My last time teaching that class before I retire. Critical Perspectives on Social Media Use is the name of it. CMST 340, Critical Perspectives on Social Media Use, if you're interested in this kind of stuff about user-created content. Speaking of that, let's move on to the next element in our erotic analysis. It's fandom and cultural production. Fandom and cultural production. Fans, football fans included, rock fans, rap fans, they used to be kind of ridiculed as nuts, crazy people, right? But a very serious study began of fans in the 1980s by John Fiske. He was a semiologist, also Henry Jenkins and Camille Bacon Smith. And I have to give a nod to my colleague, Dr. Charlie Warner. This is what his research is all about, and he's also retiring. If you want to take a class with Charlie that deals with this fandom, it's being taught in the spring semester at CMST 342, Pop Music as Cultural Text, CMST 342. So fandom is a serious study of people that are fans. And the fans, according to Erotic Analysis, are doing much more than just celebrating and being happy about whatever they're fans of. They're also participating in cultural production. They're producing messages outside of the media messages. You've got semiotic productivity. That's the use of symbols and text to enhance everyday lives. If you wear a New York hat because you're a Yankees fan, you got the NY, or you have a person who's NYPD in your family, or you just love the city and NY represents the city to you, makes you feel better, helps you get through the day. It makes you feel like you're not losing your New York identity being all the way out here in rural Pennsylvania in the mountains. That's semiotic productivity, using symbols to enhance our everyday lives. Then there's also enunciative productivity where fans publicly debate and discuss their shared interests. You've got Yankees fans and Mets fans and Giants fans and Eagles fans. That's in the football world, right? You've got public school professors like me, and you've got Ivy League professors that I will interact with, and we'll both try to show that we have value beyond what the other one can offer. You've got fans of all kinds of media content that are out there, and enunciative productivity is where fans debate and discuss their shared interests. Is happening outside of the Giants game that just took place. It's happening outside of the Eagles game next week. Fans are engaging in cultural production. And then you have textual productivity, products that fans create. I have a former student on my Facebook who's constantly selling jerseys from the Philadelphia Eagles. I mean, that's taking an item that piece of clothing with a person's name on their back and adding to it, is putting his own textual productivity on it, products that fans create. He displays it on a mannequin. He has a certain font that he uses for everyone. That's creating textual productivity. Now let's look at reflections on transgression as we wrap things up here. What can we say about it? Remember that we've studied pleasure, and we've also studied transgression, which is part of pleasure. And trying to get to where they intersect, though, is not so easy. Like, when is pleasure normal pleasure, or at least not abnormal pleasure? And when is transgression crossing over those boundaries? It's ultimately an individual decision. Erotic analysis does provide for the study of pleasures that texts afford. Is that not an interesting way of saying it? Pleasures that texts afford means they're there for the taking if you want them. It does provide for participatory practices of audiences. The question therefore becomes do pleasures function transgressively or productively? Do they push us into worlds where we become less and less able to interact with other human beings, perhaps even into criminality, as is the case for pedophiles? Or do texts provide us with the tools for social resistance? Social resistance including subversion, disruption, and other kinds of aggressive actions that we can see in social movements, like a protest is an aggressive action. Laying down, where tanks are supposed to roll across with arms, can derive pleasure, right? You can feel pleasure, the thrill and the adrenaline of being underneath a tank, that a military person who's a human being has the ability to roll over you, but they don't because they have been given commands not to. There's a bizarre, grotesque thrill comes there, but it's also an act of subversion to try and make a point about war. Or the people who put spikes in trees where logging is taking place in Portland so that the trees are not taken out. Those are disruptive practices. They're also illegal. So at what point is transgression bad? That's a decision that you'll have to make. And fortunately, that's what media criticism is all about. Have a great day.